The BBC tonight is telling a tale to all of Britain about a most curious find.
3, 2, 1, and cue.
Always going to be seen as one of the most intriguing characters of the 20th century.
This is the missing piece in the story of the Cambridge spies.
Not its find, ours, CBC's. A discovery of 9 minutes of film few seem to know existed, and apparently matters an awful lot. The fuss is for a figure long dead, one of the so-called Cambridge Five of London in the 1950s. The Savile Row shopping, well-educated wonders, supposedly the best of British establishment. Really, though, they were spies working for the Soviet Union. Hard to overstate how big this betrayal was to Britain then. And a certain arrogant, flamboyant turncoat, Guy Burgess, was the most mysterious and frustrating of all. He seemingly spent the Cold War in a drunken haze, arms full of stolen secrets, eventually defecting to Moscow. This was thought to be the only moving images of him at that time, just a glimpse. To this day, movies and plays keep trying to figure him out.
He rebelled against his family. He outraged his friends. Then, finally, he betrayed his country.
Many have portrayed him, including Benedict Cumberbatch as Burgess, the young BBC journalist talking to Winston Churchill.
What's your poison? Whiskey?
Well, it's almost 11, why not?
What we know is that Burgess bolted for the Soviet Union in 1951 and seemed to disappear. He never met justice, never explained himself, never answered the mountains of questions the British had for him about the secrets he took or why. Was believed to have never given a television interview. Historians thought they had written the very last word on Guy Burgess, had long ago stopped looking for film of him, had just declared it simply didn't exist. It did indeed exist, and it's been sitting in the CBC vault since 1959. That's because Burgess gave just one television interview after he ran for Moscow, and it seems he gave it to CBC, to a weekly show called Close Up. Problem was, for decades, it wasn't labeled, cataloged only when it was transferred from film. So the interview just sat there unacknowledged until archivist Arthur Schwartzel spotted it and realized instantly it was a find.
Guy Burgess. And it meant something to me right away. This is, I think, the biggest thing that I've stumbled on in the collection for sure. It's 1959, and he's a villain, and he's trying to explain himself.
He knew a story when he saw one, knew others needed to see it, knew the Brits probably should be the first. Nowhere better to give it a showing than London's Reform Club. Once a gentleman's club, it's where Burgess used to drink, tell his grandiose stories. It is the last place he was seen before he defected, having one final cocktail. So we gathered Jill Bennett, the historian for the British Intelligence Service, Guy Burgess researchers, spy authors, a journalist who once knew Burgess and the Cambridge Five, to show them the interview, tell the story of how it came to be.
So, shall we take our seats?
Shot by a famed and gutsy cameraman named Eric Derschmied, who captured some of the 20th century's most crucial interviews and said he had a few people he wanted to find in Moscow. He says that he went to Moscow for CBC on a hunch. He had a number of people he wanted to find. He checked into the Hotel Ukraine and went for lunch and met a waiter who said, "I'd like your jeans." And he said, "Well, you can have my jeans if you give me Guy Burgess's phone number." So he says he went away for the afternoon and came back that night for dinner. A little piece of paper was handed to him with a phone number, and he handed the man his jeans, and away you go. If you're all happy and ready, here we go. The show itself just so curious, even as a time capsule.
In Moscow last week, Close Up met Guy Burgess and interviewed him in the shadow of the Kremlin. This was Guy Burgess when he disappeared in 1951. At that, a passport photo. A lifetime later, Burgess speaks to the West for the first time about his defection.
I simply went as a tourist. I and my friend approached the Russians, said, could we come in? They kept us waiting in Prague for some weeks, then agreed.
Everybody considered you and McLean to be traitors. What have you to say to that, Mr. Burgess?
It's no use me saying that I'm not a traitor. That means nothing. Of course I'm not, but that's only I who know that.
Well, the Attorney General might interpret your activities differently. But, Mr. Burgess, you're thinking of visiting England. Do you have any immediate plans?
No, I told you earlier, I want to live in the Soviet Union because I'm a socialist and it's a socialist country, and I enjoy doing so. On the other hand, naturally, everybody likes his own country best. Immediately, I would rather like to go back to England for a month to see my family. But I will never do that unless I can be quite certain that I can get out of England and come back to Russia.
Burgess's tone, demeanor, exactly as they imagined it to be.
Absolutely wonderful. I would have thought that would have been virtually the scoop of the 1950s for television.
It is a crucial missing piece in the Burgess jigsaw.
It underlined the impression that Burgess really is a very unstable character.
That he would go on television and say, I want to come back to Britain. I don't think we ever knew that he'd been that keen to go on Britain that he would ever have actually done it almost in public.
The only one in the room who actually knew Burgess in Moscow, journalist Robert Elphick.
He used to turn up in our parties. Suddenly you found this figure in his shiny dark blue suit and his dirty Italian tie, gulping your whiskey.
There were enough nuggets of information in those few minutes they asked to see it again.
Tell me, what do the Russian people think of Canada? Do they think of us as a satellite of the United States?
Look here, I'm most unwilling to give any answer as to what the Russian people think. I'm a quarter Canadian myself.
Of course, he slipped that Canadian reference in and didn't elaborate. Typical Burgess, apparently. A short interview, long on attitude.
If he has earned the title of non-party Bolshevik, Guy Burgess has equally earned the scorn of the homeland he deserted. Next week, Malcolm Muggeridge...
And so only the interview's second showing in nearly 60 years. That is a detail the spy watchers can't seem to get over.
I'm still amazed that, particularly given the CBC's close contact with the BBC over many years, that nobody in the BBC knew this existed, and nobody in the BBC ever arranged for it to be transmitted.
Why didn't a Briton obsessed with Burgess pick up that CBC interview right after it aired nearly 60 years ago? We tried to find out, made calls, looked into records, but if there is an answer, it seems lost for good. This isn't a huge concern for Britain. They are busy tonight, deconstructing the sad and desperate tone and look of Burgess, each word mulled over.
One of the wonderful things is that in any subject, however much you discover, there's always something left to discover. And this is the most interesting discovery for quite some time.
And us? Well, we've gone back to the archives because apparently you just never know what or who lurks in the climate-controlled bunkers of our history. Adrienne Arsenault, CBC News, Toronto.